I explain neoliberalism very simply as having at least three components. One is markets and marketisation, the second one is self-interest, both working at the level of individuals but also at the level of institutions, and the third one is laissez-faire politics or deregulation. And you've got a book series on this as well, so you're quite an expert on this. So maybe how would you explain neoliberalism in its kind of simplest formulation to somebody who doesn't know what neoliberalism is?
Neoliberalism is capitalism. It is current, today capitalism. Capitalism has gone through different forms over the last 200 years. Laissez-faire capitalism of the 19th century, post-Second World War, because of the power of the workers, because of the power of working class organisations such as trade unions, and it must be admitted, political parties as well. Then the working class secured a welfare state, secured concessions. They weren't given, but they fought for and demanded and succeeded in getting a welfare state, a national health service, education for people beyond the age of 15, decent unemployment pay, decent maternity benefits. So what are the key features? Okay, privatisation. So in Britain, there's a whole list of industries that Margaret Thatcher privatised. The coal industry, the steel industry, a big section of the road haulage industry, a section of the air transport industry, water, gas, electricity. Just about anything that moves, the Conservatives will privatise. Okay, so that's privatisation. Then they believe in competition, they believe in marketisation, although they've created some private sector monopolies, but they say that marketisation, competition, will improve standards.
So Dave, let me just chip in there for a second. This idea of competition making things better, if you pitch two things together, or two people or two companies together, they'll try to outdo each other and become more efficient, better services, higher quality products and so forth. Has that worked for us or how has it worked for us in health, education and transportation since Thatcher?
I use Southern Rail. Need I say more? The service is absolutely appalling. There have been so many reports in education about the impact of competition, about the impact of marketisation. We now know that there's a majority of high schools or secondary schools are academies, which are self-governing schools taken out of the control of the local authority, the democratically elected local authority. And there's also thousands of primary schools which are academies. That is the way that the Conservatives are seeking to marketise the state schooling system. In theory, schools, academies are not for profit. It's just that some of them pay the boss hundreds of thousands of pounds, a lot more than the Prime Minister, for example. And there's been, both you and I have written on this, there's been so many hundreds of examples of people saying, oh, we need a cleaning company to clean the school. Oh, my cousin runs one of them. Or we need somebody to do the school meals, etc., etc. So much semi-privatisation. So no overall increase or improvement in standards. The pressure on the pressure on the National Health Service and on schools is huge, and this is underfunding. And I'm going to link underfunding to deliberate underfunding and to a deliberate lowering of standards, to therefore the Conservatives and capitalists saying we need private enterprise to take over. And so it's classic. Noam Chomsky writes a lot on this. It's absolutely classic. You defund or underfund, then you criticise the result, and then you privatise. And so we are seeing already privatisation in the health service, and we're seeing the effects on doctors and nurses, the staffing levels, etc., and the impacts on patient care. And this is obscene. This is obscene, absolutely obscene. It's absolutely unnecessary. We are the 6th richest country in the world. If the wealth were and the income were distributed more evenly, we could have top quality services, life chances, lifestyles, lives for our population.
So what do you say to those people who say, but there's not enough money to have a better healthcare system? There's not enough money to have more higher quality, comprehensive schools.
These are political decisions. The money's there. And I'll make a cheap jibe, about Theresa May's.
Go ahead.
There's no magic money tree. Well, there was £1 billion to buy out the shall I call them religious extremists? No, I'll call them fundamental Protestants, the homophobic Protestants, the DUP in Northern Ireland, so she's got a majority in Parliament. So there's £1 billion there. If there's money, they'll find it. There's 100, or is it 200 billion pounds to renew the Trident new missile system. Of course, we're all very grateful for Trident for protecting us from bombers on the streets of London. It works wonderfully. So the money is there. It's purely political decisions. And actually, I'll rephrase that. It's a class decision. I write a little bit on critical social and critical policy analysis. And for every policy, small policy in a school like how you organise the kids, macro policy like defence or money on the National Health Service or privatisation, for every single policy, major or minor, you should always ask the question, who wins, who loses?
It's my view that grammar schools are being expanded, and there's been more and more. There's a concerted effort to have more academy schools, perhaps every single school in the country to be an academy, and that's just part of an expansion of the market. Who wins from this expansion of the market?
Well, I can tell you who loses. I mean, it's the poor sections of the population, and not just the poor. The working class is not just the precariat and the unskilled and the semi-skilled workers who earn less than minimum wage. The working class, in general, loses from that marketisation. I mean, already there's some chains of schools are owned by hedge funds, some international chains owned by hedge funds. Could they care a sod about kids in a school in Limehouse? Of course they couldn't. They couldn't care a sod. They care about the bottom line, and it is socially irresponsible. And I think a lot of this government and neoliberal capitalist governments globally, a lot of their actions, which they know will result in misery for and inhibited life chances, I actually think they're criminal.
You've mentioned schools and teachers on a number of occasions, but we must also note that this marketisation, this neoliberalisation, is not restricted to only schools but universities too.
What we are seeing with the more marketised system is we are seeing. And it will become even more marketised when the cap on fees is lifted and Oxford and Cambridge can charge 20,000, 30,000 a year. We need to get rid of the fee-paying system. We need to reinstate the grants. We need to reinstate educational maintenance allowances that allowed people like me and my grandson, until they were stopped, not the grandson stopped, until the grants were stopped. Both me and my grandson, how's that? Me in 1961 and my grandson, 10 years ago, we both benefited from a grant to enable us to stay on at school. I remember going to Marks and Spencer's with clothes vouchers, getting vests and pants and socks. Actually, the woman I married was serving behind the till, but it wasn't knockoff. It was. I gave her the vouchers. And similarly, when I went to university in 1963, Manchester University, not only were there no fees, I had a living grant. It was such a living grant, I could give my mum, who was a factory worker at the time, I could give her money when I came home. I had to work on building sites every holiday, of course, and people would say, but we can't afford it. Where's the magic money tree? But you can afford it. Yeah. Finland does it. Yeah. There's a couple of countries in Africa do it. There's a number of countries. I think Sweden, I'm not sure. Scotland does it for people in Scotland. Yeah. Yeah. It's a question of political will. Absolutely. Where you put the money. We talked about class earlier on, and that is what is missing from debate, from understanding, from the media. It is the fact that there are millions of people who can't afford to heat their houses, who can't afford to eat properly, who sometimes go without food so that their kids could eat. And I know what it's like because I grew up in a family which, after my parents divorced when I was 14, was actually poor. And I know what it's like. I know what it's like not to have, the only jacket I had was a school jacket. I was a decent footballer. They used to call me Crippler-ill. I was a defender. I was determined. I never had my own pair of football boots, ever. I used to get a different pair from lost property every week. And I remember seeing for the first time a kid, good footballer, come to play a football match with new football boots. I looked at them with amazement. Now, this is me 55 years ago, but it's today. Yes. It's today with the kids who cannot afford decent shoes, decent trainers, decent clothing, and the kids who go to school hungry every day because their parents haven't got the money for breakfast.
Given neoliberalism has done what it's done, austerity, plunged people back into the 1950s in terms of not being able to afford football boots and things like that, as you've just mentioned. Could you say something about the way we're kept in line, the ideological and the state, repressive state apparatuses that you've already mentioned?
How does this 0.1% of the population live lives of absolute luxury, whereas there are many millions who are doing okay, but many millions who frequently are miserable because of lack of money, lack of decent housing, etc., etc. They get away with it by two means. They get away with it by using the ideological state apparatuses, by using the media that they control. I mean, do you own a newspaper? I don't. There's 8 people control 80% of all news media in Britain. Now, are they going to give voice to working class concerns? Or are they going to support their own concerns and those of their shareholders? So the ideological state apparatuses of the media are also, in many periods and at most times, the church, the temple, the gurdwara, the synagogue, the mosque, which generally want to keep on fairly good terms with the ruling class. Of course, within each religion there are resistant movements. Sure. But the ISA that I haven't mentioned, which I will now mention, another one is the family. But the one we are talking about now is the education system, where people are encouraged to believe that the system is fair, that we live in a meritocracy. If you work hard, you can get on, lad. That's all it needs, hard work. And so there is that, the imposition, the attempted imposition, that's not always successful, the attempted imposition of a particular hegemonic ideology, what Gramsci called common sense. And so the media, the schools, many of the religious institutions try to put over this view in schools and universities that, hey, things are pretty good. Yes, of course, we need the odd little reform here. Perhaps welfare benefits need to come up a little bit, but hey, it's a good system. And so that's the ideological state apparatuses. And universities are implicit as well, and of course the government is steadily reduced. The thinking subjects, if I can call them that, sociology, philosophy, the courses are being closed down. Money is being given to STEM subjects, science, technology, economics, and management actually as well. So it's a deliberate reformulation, restructuring of universities so that you don't. It's deliberate, so that you don't get so many thinkers, except for the elite. They're allowed to think, but the workers are not allowed to think. That's the ideological state apparatuses. What happens when they don't work? You know, when people get so pissed off that they start rebelling or rioting or going on mass demonstrations. Well, what happens then? Venting views uncomfortable to the government on the internet, Facebook and etc. Well, that's where the repressive state apparatuses come in. That's where the government changes the law, makes it more difficult to go on strike, forbids sympathetic strike action, controls the number of pickets on a picket line, makes unions jump through all sorts of hoops before you can call a strike. That's where, when you have urban rebellions, you get people sent to prison for 6 months for stealing a bottle of water, whereas people who've stolen billions, bankers, get away scot-free. So the law comes in, and after those riots in London, and the same was true of the riots in the 80s, you know, the government say, okay, we're going to have 24-hour courts, we're going to deal with this quickly. They didn't deal with the bankers' crisis, or the bankers very quickly. But so the RSAs, they changed the law. And if that doesn't work, then they send in the police. And so we've seen, I don't know if you have, but I think you have been kettled. You know, the police have been trying to clamp down on demonstrations to make it uncomfortable. So people are held in a more and more restricted area, no toilets, having to stand up for perhaps 10 hours.
No water, no medical facilities, no access to legal representation.
Yeah. And I go around different, I'm very fortunate in my life, I go and talk to trade union groups and academic audiences and left-wing political groups in different countries. So in England we have kettling. In the States, you have assassination of anybody who is, Malcolm X, the Kennedys, the Martin Luther King, and there were even plans. The FBI was drawing up plans to kill leaders of the Occupy movement, and the Black Panthers were dealt with by shooting. In Greece, I've been tear-gassed on a number of occasions with my comrades in Syntagma Square. And the police there, they use the tear gas very willingly, and they have the Delta Squad cops who go, one on a bike in the front driving, the other one with a baton on the back, smacking people. And even worse in Turkey, where people get killed in demonstrations, and the government has authorised the use of live bullets. So the repressive state apparatuses step in when the ideological state apparatuses cease to work. And I want to refer back to something I talked about. Chris Nineham wrote a book on Lukács. And I'm going to repeat a phrase I used half hour ago, that there comes a time when workers, the working class, when people see through the media lies, see through the media representation, see through the bread and circuses of the mass media, and say, no, this is wrong. And when that happens, we can phrase it in terms of a subjective understanding of objective conditions. And that's what we've got now. I'm not going to pretend we got a pre-revolutionary situation in Britain, but there's a far greater political and social awareness.
You made me think about ISA and RSA and the way that it's actually kind of something which I've experienced and witnessed. I remember being course leader for an education studies degree at a previous university, and the Vice-Chancellor said to me, "Alpesh, how are you delivering the government's agenda?" Actually, I'm not. I must leave this job, and I did in the end. And the whole idea of kettling, you know, it's really horrendous. It is essentially kidnapping a whole group of people and trying to squeeze their will. And in order to get out of the kettle, they will take your fingerprints and they'll take a swab from your mouth. And if you refuse, you're arrested. Yeah. Okay.
So it's intimidation as well.
Absolutely.
State intimidation. Yeah.
Absolutely.
One thing that I mention regularly whenever I give speeches is if you protest alone, if you're one person, you're very vulnerable. If there's 10 of you, you're still vulnerable. If there's 100,000 of you, which there have been in Greece, in Syntagma Square, in demonstrations round the world, and in London, 150,000 demonstration 3 or 4 years back over student fees and EMA grants being abolished, then we're powerful. And then the ruling class can shake.